I felt yesterday was really a terrific symposium with an incredibly diverse group of participants from different backgrounds, including remarkably some neurosurgeons, me and Jim Doty. I'm amazed at how this CCARE has accomplished so much in such a short period of time. And I was reminiscing last night with some people at the dinner that 2 years ago, Project Compassion was a concept only, originated really by Jim Doty. And it's Jim's dedication and passion for this, this notion that has largely contributed to its current success. Bill Mobley was involved from the very beginning, and with a donation of stock from Jim to the Department of Neurosurgery in the year 2000 that finally came to fruition in 2007, we supported JINPA to spend 1 week a month at Stanford. He actually had an appointment in the Department of Neurosurgery. And I don't know if you've heard JINPA's story, but he was coming across the border from Canada and got stopped at immigration because they saw neurosurgery and on his visa, and so the immigration officer started interrogating him, trying to pump him for information about some of his intracranial problems, but JINPA pleaded ignorance. At any rate, we also engaged very early on Brian Knutson and Tenzin to the project, and the rest is history. Now CCARE is a center. It's part of our new Neuroscience Institute, the Stanford Institute for Neuroinnovation and Translational Neuroscience, a very important part of it. And its success, it continues largely due to the support of Wayne Wu and Meng and many others. So what motivated Jim to altruistically donate millions of shares of Accuray stock to Stanford and other charitable organizations in 2000, while his own personal fortune evaporated due to the dot-com bust? What besides the tax write-off, that is. Well, that's the topic of this session, actually, altruistic behavior research and neuroeconomics. We've changed the order and actually changed the discussant. The first speaker is going to be James Andreoni, a professor of economics at UC San Diego. Jim is a leader in the field of public economics, widely known for promoting the theory that charitable giving creates a warm glow feeling that rewards the giver, in addition to any purely altruistic motives. His current work aims to explore the contribution of human nature versus social culture to the warm glow, and to design fundraising mechanisms and self-governing rules for charitable organizations. He has been invited to lecture throughout the world, is very involved in organized economic public service nationally. James Andreoni, a professor.
Thank you for the introduction, for including me in this wonderful event. And when I was Bill's dissertation advisor and he was getting his PhD, we both had hair as well. Yes, I've been working on questions of altruism for my whole career. When I started out doing it, I was thought of something of an outsider, somebody working on something crazy and unusual. And it's just really wonderful now to see a room filled with people of all different backgrounds who are coming together to work on these kinds of issues. So it's nice that we've kind of come under the light now and we're legitimately recognized. So I have sort of two missions today. One is to sort of give you some background about how economists think about altruism and charitable giving, sort of set the table for my next two speakers, some of the issues they're going to talk about, as well as talk about some of my own recent research. So I study charitable giving in a number of different ways, or altruism. I study it as a mainstream, old-fashioned public finance economist, that is somebody who cares about government and taxes and And I studied things like the charitable deduction and tax benefits for giving and the effects of those, and how charities structure themselves to raise money and spend money and the impacts of all these various inputs into the process of gathering and spending funds. And I also study it from a sort of behavioral point of view. So I do laboratory experiments where we try to get at what kind of things motivate people, what are they thinking and feeling, how are they affected by others, and so forth. So I'll show you some of that. So I'm going to try to go through a little bit of all of those for you. I'm going to rush through the first part a little bit more. So like everybody else, I have a slide with definitions on the first slide. So as we talked about yesterday, you notice that compassion is a recognition or a feeling of understanding somebody else's suffering, but doesn't necessarily require action. And my definition of altruism that I'd like to go off of is the one by Thomas Nagel, where he says, by altruism I mean not abject self-sacrifice, but really a willingness to act in the consideration of the interests of others without the need of ulterior motives. So notice there are two parts of this definition, and I like both of them. So first is that it must act in the consideration of others. So I must be motivated because I care about the consequences for somebody else, and I care about it in a positive way. It may or may not imply sacrifice on my part, but I get some joy from seeing your joy go up. Okay? But second, it need not include ulterior motives rooted in selfishness to explain behavior. So ulterior motives may exist alongside altruism, but they cannot be the only motives, right? So, so let's suppose that there are no ulterior motives, but altruism is pure in this sense. And the only joy I get is in seeing your joy go up. Then suppose I were to witness somebody else giving $1 to some. So I'm walking down the street and there's someone begging on the street. I see somebody else giving $1 to that person. That should give me as much joy as if I had done it myself. That's if my altruism is pure. In fact, I'm actually happier that somebody else did it because now, first of all, I have more money in my pocket and the person isn't quite as needy as they used to be. So maybe I don't need to give them as much, right? So a purely altruistic person might actually be less generous in a situation like this. Suppose the government were to tax me and provide charitable services or services that are substitutes for what charities do, or maybe give money directly to the charity. So the government takes money from me that I might have already, and I'm already giving to this charity. The government takes money to me and then gives it to the charity. Both of those should make me just as happy. I should be indifferent between doing it myself and having the government do it for me. All right, so this should result in a crowding out of sorts, that the government should just kind of replace private contributions if we're in a world of pure altruism. I should be indifferent to having my gifts observed or recognized or announced. And so I'm not motivated by any kind of social pressure or conformity or praise. But of course, none of those things are really true. We all, I think for the most part, it's very rare to think of somebody who's not motivated by some of these ulterior motives. So people get a joy of being, just a joy of giving, a joy of making a difference. And this is sort of, when I was a graduate student, I didn't know better. I gave it this name, the warm glow of giving, because I thought it was kind of funny, and it would lighten the subject a little bit and make it more accessible. But I think, but the term has stuck. But I think it's a good term, and it's a good in the sense that it does sort of say, let's not take this particular formulation of it too seriously. It's really meant to be more general, that there's some feelings that we get, some ulterior motives, basically, of some kind, that give us direct benefits that get us to act on our compassion. And that's the idea. People don't like paying taxes. We get incomplete crowding out. We don't have the government just displacing private charities. They both go in together. And social motives for giving really abound. We see them everywhere. People are concerned about their social image, that is what other people think of them, their self-image, what they think of themselves, seeking praise and recognition, signaling social status, and there's all kinds of social norms and expectations that we should be generous in giving. And so these things clearly are a big part of why people are altruistic or behave altruistically. So how can we convert compassionate feelings to altruistic acts? So I would contend that most people probably have compassion at some degree, and maybe some have more than others, but of course not everybody acts on it. And often, if not always, it requires some of these ulterior motives to get people to act on their compassion. So understanding these motives is something that economists can work on. We can sort of formalize our theories and models of these ulterior motives, and through observation, surveys, looking at people's tax returns, doing controlled laboratory experiments, we can try to get at those. So most economic research on altruism over the past 20 years has been focused on these ulterior motives. So in the real world, we look at charitable giving. That's the most easily measured and commonly measured aspect of charitable giving, and it has enough variation across people to try to get some sense of why people are doing what they're doing. We can study both the givers themselves, and we can observe the organizations that run the charitable organizations and see how they behave, and look at government policies and get out the interactions of them all. In the lab, we can do experiments on giving between and among subjects, and in the fMRI studies that the next two speakers will talk about, we can have people give and receive charity under various circumstances. So that's how we're going to study these things. So there are lots of questions that economists are asking, and I'm not going to answer many of these right for you today, but just give you a sense of the kinds of things that people can ask. Is charitable giving good for society? So we could have a benevolent government instead, or we can rely on the charitable sector. And I think the United States has made one choice, and Europe has sort of made another choice, where we have a big charitable sector in the U.S., bigger than in many other countries. We rely on fundraising rather than taxes to provide for a lot of social services. So which institution is better? It's an open question. And who ends up helping for the disadvantaged? And is that burden shared fairly? The interesting thing about relying on the charitable sector is that it's the nice people who end up bearing the burden rather than it being shared equally. And that's very, very admirable, of course, but is that the way we want our society organized? What are the effects of charity on recipients? So when someone receives, so if you're really altruistic, you should care about how as altruistic person or altruistic society, how do the recipients feel? And are we creating a situation where the recipients are grateful and appreciative, or are they sort of stigmatized? So there's lots of evidence that, for instance, people who qualify for welfare benefits don't go and sign up for them. Only about 50% take-up rates on things like food stamps, right? So there's people who maybe feel ashamed at this accepting this gift, right? So are we creating a world where we have too much of that, and we want to try to reduce those things? And what is in the social interest in promoting these ulterior motives? So does charity cause social cohesion? So that's I think a good question. If we have lots of private organizations that provide charitable services, that working with other people and meeting, fellow travelers is a wonderful thing for society, and that has benefits in other dimensions. So maybe this is something we want to promote. There is some research, however, that shows that when we have more diverse societies that have diversity in ethnic, religious, racial diversity, this is within the United States. Some of these communities have lower charitable giving the more diverse they are. Okay, so what's happening, we don't really know, but one hypothesis is that the giving is more parochial, more localized, right? So people are giving to their churches and staying within those and not interacting with other people, for instance. So maybe this is having some other unintended consequences. So these are the kinds of questions that people are asking. So let me just give you some quick facts about charitable giving in the United States. It's about $260 to $300 billion, which used to sound like a big amount of money. But it's been about 1.9%, it's hovering around 2% of income for the last 30 years. Most of it comes from individual giving, 77% from individuals, but foundations and bequested corporations also give. About 70% of U.S. households report giving to charity, and most of it comes to education and health. Here's a table I just grabbed from a review article I wrote a couple years ago, so I should have updated a little bit here, but But you can see the idea. Here's giving as a percentage of income. That's the 2% line. So it kind of goes back and forth across that over the years, and right now it's about 1.9%. Total giving in dollars has been going up constantly, but here we had a big run up in the stock market, of course, and so giving went up. So I'm just going to guess that that goes back down, but there's also 9/11 in here, which has was a huge time for lots of giving. So that's partly also responsible for that spike there. But the point is that giving has stayed fairly constant over the years. It's about 1.2% of income. Effective tax benefits, maybe I'll just zoom through this. Of course, as was just mentioned, if you itemize on your taxes, generally you're going to get a tax benefit from giving to charity. So that acts as a subsidy. It lowers your costs. And this has been, as a public finance economist, the main area that people have studied and asked, and what are the consequences of giving a tax benefit, of lowering the price of giving to people? Does it encourage them to give more? In fact, it does. The studies are kind of all over the place about how much, but about 15 to 40% more charity comes through because we have these government subsidies, and people are more likely to give. Okay, so let's just go to the next one. So here's just a quick summary of some work that I'm just finishing up with Abigail Payne. We got a sample of about 8,000 charities over about 14 years in the United States. And charities, even though they don't pay taxes, they have to file tax returns. And so this is the source of our data. And we're able to sort out how much money they spend on charitable fundraising, and it turns out, and how much money they receive in funds raised. And we're able to estimate that fundraising is very productive. About $5 is raised for every dollar that is spent. Now, as economists, that makes you think they're leaving money on the table, because it should be, that last dollar should raise you an extra dollar if you're profit maximizers in this world. So that's an interesting issue that charities do leave a lot of money on the table. And one might ask why. We find that donations are not directly affected by government grants. That people don't say, oh, I gave through my taxes, therefore I don't need to give directly. In fact, to the extent that government displaces any private contributions, it's because charities themselves quit raising money. Right? It's as if they have some goal in mind of how much money they need to raise. They get a grant from the government. They say, great, we can cancel that marathon that we were going to sponsor. We don't have to have another banquet or something like that. So that's the way government and individual giving interacts. We just got a grant I heard about yesterday from the British government in conjunction with a woman who works at Warwick named Kim Scharf. And we're going to study social networking sites. And Britain has a social networking site for giving. And so that's going to be an interesting, another way that people raise money that we're going to be studying. Let's turn to the experimental evidence, because I think that's probably what most people are interested in here, and what's occupying me these days. So there are thousands of studies here. This has been extremely popular, huge growth in this over the last 15 years or so. And there's a bunch of different theories about how people give, but the basic finding is that people do clearly have consistent and predictable preferences for doing good, for sharing with others, for doing nice things. And they respond the way an economist would think they respond. You give them more money, and they give more money away. If it's cheaper to give more money, people give more money. So they respond to the price of giving. They care about efficiency, so you might call that utilitarian. So they care that basically that I, as the experimenter, spend a lot of money. That the subjects make a lot. They care that the subjects make the most money they can. Even if it's not myself who's making the money, subjects will show a concern that we as a pair sort of maximize our benefits, our total sum benefits. But they also care about equity, about the two subjects making the same amount of money. And these are not always at odds, but they sometimes are in conflict. Turns out that women care disproportionately more about equity, and men care disproportionately more about efficiency, which might not be surprising to everybody. And men are more responsive to, this is, of course, all the women in the room will immediately recognize this. Men are more responsive to price. So when it's cheap to be nice, they're real nice. They're much nicer than women. But when it's expensive to be nice, the women are nicer than men. So women are much more consistent, if you will, in doing the right thing always. So today what I'm going to do next is talk about 3 studies. One of somebody else has sort of introduced things, and 2 more that I'm doing. One, I saved the best one for last, of course. I know a lot of you have been talking about some preliminary data, but I think I've gotten you beat because I got these figures this morning from my research assistant who sent them to me at about 1 o'clock last night. So it's data on an experiment we ran just on Tuesday. Okay, so we're going to talk about, all of these are going to talk about the Dictator game, and this was introduced yesterday by Richie. The idea is 2 subjects are paired. You give one subject some money, usually $10, maybe $20, and you give them the opportunity to share some of that with another subject. And typically this is an anonymous subject, so we might be in a big room and we're told somebody else in this room is going to be the recipient of this. You don't know who it is. Right? So typically people on average give about 25%, but there are spikes at both 0 and 50%. So here's a graph, just ignore the gray part, just look at the total size, total height here. So this is a $10 Dictator game. This is not my data, this is just a convenient, all the pictures look the same, so this is one that's convenient to grab. There's a big spike of people giving $5 out of the 10, a big spike of people giving 0 out of the 10. But you see there's this precipitous drop right here, and then there's a little mass that comes up in the middle, then a drop again, and then that spike. That's the usual pattern that you always see. There's like a cliff here, and then a little mountain, and then a cliff. Okay? And that's an interesting pattern, and one that we've noticed and we're going to try to use to explain some behavioral models. So here's a paper by Dana, Kane, and Dawes. And what they do is they do a $10 Dictator game. But then, so the Dictator first makes this choice, and then they secretly give the dictators another choice. And that is they can stick with what they've chosen, or they can choose to exit. And what exiting means is, instead of playing this $10 Dictator game, they're going to get $9 for sure that goes just to them. The recipient gets nothing, and we don't tell the recipient that there was even a Dictator game possibility. They don't know that you ever even existed, right? So first of all, you made a choice in a Dictator game. You're given $10. You make a choice in the Dictator game, and you're given a chance to just say, forget about that, and I will secretly just disappear with $9, and the recipient gets nothing. Okay, so one hypothesis is that exiting can never be better than staying, because what you do with $9 can't be better than what you've already chosen to do with $10, right? Anything you're going to do with that $9, you could have done with that initial $10, right? So, so the pure economic motive is of course you should never exit. So why would you exit? Well, maybe being put in the situation of being asked to give, being given the opportunity to give, burdens you somehow. And I think there was a mention yesterday about how lucky we were to get this grant money for the conference here, but it created a burden on us to have to actually do it. Okay, now this isn't exactly the same thing as that, but being put in an uncomfortable situation of having to behave well morally might make people feel uncomfortable, and they would be willing to sacrifice $1 of total benefits in order to avoid being put in this uncomfortable situation of making this morally conflicting decision. So this is like, exiting is like avoiding the beggar. You're walking down the street and you see there's a beggar there. You know that if you look this beggar in the eye, that you're going to reach into your pocket and you're going to have to give him some money. All right? And so what do? You look the other way, maybe, you cross the street, you take some effort, some diversionary tactics to try to avoid coming into contact with this beggar, because you know that will incite in you the need to act on it, to give. And if you walk right by, then you feel really terrible. All right? So you're happier just avoiding the situation altogether. And that's the analogy they want to make with this kind of experiment. And this, in fact, was the picture I showed you earlier without the legend on here. It was exactly their data. So the the total height is the dictator choice, and then after they give people a chance to exit, the gray part is the people who are exiting. Okay, so you'll notice a couple things. First of all, there's a fair bit of exiting here, all right? So there's not zero exiting. There's a significant amount of exiting. There's not a majority of exiting, but there's a significant minority of people who are deciding that they'd rather avoid the morally complicated, morally compromising decision altogether and just take $9 and get lost. But another interesting thing is this exiting doesn't really correlate with what their dictator choices were. Okay? Even these people who are giving one, so they could be just as well off for themselves, but not be seen by the other person as having been selfish. Right? About a third of those people choose to exit, but not everybody. So that's the candidates you might think might have been most likely to exit. But then what this indicates to us is there is some sort of sense of a cost of adhering to the social norm, or some cost of facing this morally compromising situation. Then I'm going to talk about 2 more papers. So this is one that I've just completed with Doug Bernheim. We just got this accepted. Doug Bernheim, by the way, is a Stanford professor of economics. And the idea here is that one of the social norms you notice is that splitting things 50-50 is very common. So you go to dinner with somebody, say, let's just split the check. Right? Business ventures are very often 50-50 splits of the profits. When you're bargaining with somebody, you name a price, they name a price, you say, well, let's split the difference. Right? These are all kinds of things. I think we can all agree there's a fairly strong norm in society that things should be shared 50-50. If Bill and I are walking down the street and we find 2 $20 bills on the street, we'd probably say, well, I would say, you take one, I'll take the other.
I said, who's that girl over there?
Bill was trained too well, I think, in economics. So, all right, so we'd split things 50-50. And in the dictator game, there's this very strong norm of 50-50 splits. We always see the big spike at 50-50 splitting. So the question is, why do people conform to this norm even if they could profitably deviate? So our hypothesis here is that people care about fairness, but they also care about being perceived as fair by other people. And this is an important motive for folks. So we call that social image. I get utility out of being a nice person, but I also get utility out of you feeling that I'm a nice person. Okay, both of those things give me happiness. So our test is to give people a chance to sort of hide their selfishness while preserving their social image. And if we do that, some people would become less generous. Okay, so the idea is that they use giving as a way of signaling that they're a compassionate, good person, so that the other person will feel in their minds that they're indistinguishable from somebody who really is extremely passionate in giving. So some people give 50-50 no matter what because that's their preference. They like to do that. If I'm a person who really likes to give 30% instead, it's pretty inexpensive to give 50 and look just like one of those really nice guys. Okay, so I might move up in that direction. Okay, likewise, if I'm a 20% person, or say a 10% person, and there's lots of people giving 0, well, I don't lose that much by giving 0 in terms of my social image, but I gain 10%. All right, so maybe I could get people moving in both directions because of this social image. All right, and that's what and we have a very formal 20-page theory that proves this with high-level mathematics, and you don't want to see that. So, but you can get the idea. So the experimental design is we'll have a baseline treatment where there's a $20 dictator game. So the dictator's told they could have $20 to divide between themselves and the other person. In treatment 1, we give, there's a probability P, and this varies within subjects, within any session of this treatment. Probably a P that the dictator's choice will be replaced with give 0. Right, so we're going to force you to choose give 0. And we'll tell the recipient that there was some probability that we're doing this, and they know the chance. Okay? So the idea is that if that's a small chance, if that's 0 chance, then that's a regular dictator game. As that chance goes up and up and up, if I'm a recipient and I see that I've gotten 0, there's a greater chance that it was the nasty experimenter who forced that rather than a selfish choice by the giver. Therefore, I'm less likely to infer that the giver is a selfish person. I'm going to give them more credit for probably have been being a nice person, but just being forced to give this 0. So when this happens, as we increase that probability of forcing this choice, what we'd expect is we should have more people moving from giving 50-50 to giving 0. Right? If they're really motivated by this social image, we're making it easier for them to preserve their social image while expressing their true preferences and being more selfish. Okay, so just to test to see that this is really what's going on, what we also do is another condition, treatment 2, where we make the probability P, the same probabilities that the dictator's choice will be replaced with give 1. Right, just give 1 out of 20. All right, to see if now instead of people flooding over to give 0, they flood over to give 1. And we can really distinguish them that this is our real motive, right? That they're not being totally selfish, but they're hiding behind this forced choice. Our probabilities range from 0 to 0.25, 0.5, and 0.75. All right. So here's the results with the forced choice of give 0. So here's 0% chance of that happening, and what you see here is about 55, 56% of people who are splitting 50-50. These people are giving 10 out of 20. Here's the people who are giving 0, that's about 30%. As we move to 25%, 50%, 75%, the blue line, if splitting 50-50 goes down, flattens out around 27%. The red line of giving 0 goes up. Okay? And that's just one subject there who changed her mind. Okay, so what we're seeing is that exactly what we predicted here. That when we give people something to hide behind, they hide behind it. And they end up expressing, or pooling, as we say in economics, with the other people who are selfish. This green line here is the number of people who are giving exactly 1. And you notice that's 0 everywhere. Nobody in this experiment ever gave just $1 out of the 20. Okay, and that's important because next we'll move to the forced choice of give 1. And now what we see is, again, the 50-50. Now here we got, by chance, a group that was extremely generous in round 1. Almost 70% of them are splitting 50-50. And when there's no forced choice at all, and they would be revealed as their true choice. But as we raise that probability of having something to hide behind, that goes down, that goes in half. The people giving 50%. Here's the people giving 0. That starts out pretty low and that stays pretty low. So that sort of indicates that there's a type who is willing to give 0 and doesn't really care what you think. Because for $1, they could have hidden here with these other folks who are giving 1. Okay? So now here we have a behavior that was never observed in the prior experiment. And now here we have 50% of the people choosing it. Okay? So what this says to us is that being fair is still a pretty strong motive. A lot of people are still being fair here, even though they could hide. But there's a lot of people who are motivated by the image that you have about what kind of person I am. Okay? That I care about your social image. I care about what other people think of me. And that's a strong human motive here. That's one of these ulterior motives that we were talking about earlier that get people to give. That I care what everybody else is thinking about me. And that's enough to get me to act on my compassion, to move from the easy thing to do, which is to give nothing, to taking a step and giving something positive. Okay, so this is the new experiment. This is with my graduate student, Justin Rao, the guy who was staying up late last night. This experiment has been vexing us for quite a while because the subjects never really did quite what we thought they would do. We keep having to do more experiments to try to figure out exactly what's going on here. And so we finally think that we have a story to tell, and I think partly it's been informed by what the discussion we had yesterday and hearing from a lot of the other perspectives on this kind of issue. So these dictator games that we've been talking about and that almost everybody has ever done, it's been this situation where things are anonymous. So we'll say there's somebody else in the room that's going to be the recipient of your contribution. And you don't know which one. You can't say anything to them. But you literally try to suppress those things because we don't want any winks and nods or deals made that could interfere with the incentives we're trying to study. But in reality, conversation is a huge part of a giving experience, right? And we saw from the charitable giving data that fundraisers will tell you that the most important thing that they have to decide is how much they're going to ask for. And you get to they have a term for it they call the power of the ask, right? And their rule of thumb is basically if you ask for a donation, you either A, get what you ask for, or B, you get nothing. You hardly ever get more than you ask for, or less than you ask for. They take your offer, or they don't. Right, so figuring out what to ask is very important. And so we thought we would explore that kind of thing with one of these Dictator games. So we have, so we're going to do one and two-way communication to look at the power of asking. So this was our first pass at doing this experiment. So there's a baseline where there's no communication, so that's just like the prior experiments. And then we have the ask condition. So imagine our experiment room here. We have a nice, like a classroom, and down the middle we have a curtain, so people can't see the person on the other side. And what we do is we explain what's going to go on. In the ask condition, what happens is the recipients get to, the dictator is going to fill in a form. He's going to say, I'm going to keep this much for myself, I'm going to pass this much to you. In the ask condition, the recipient first gets to say, please fill in your form this way. Right, so I get to write in numbers that I would like you to fill in. As if I were you, I want you to fill in these numbers. And then I give them a space about 2 inches deep to write a message. They can write whatever they want. The only thing they can't do is say, I'm the tall blonde, and here's my phone number, things like that. Okay? They can't do anything that would identify themselves or would create an opportunity for interaction later on. All right? And then we bring that over to the dictator. The dictator reads that and makes a choice. And then the game's over. So this is a case where there's only an ask. So to balance that out, we have an explain condition where the opposite occurs. The dictator fills in the blank and then gets the same space and can write whatever the dictator wants. All right? And explain their choice. And then we pass that around the other side of the curtain to the recipient, and the game's over. All right? And the dictators get to leave the room first, and we wait 2 minutes, and then we let the recipients go. So then we have two-way communication. So we have ask and explain, where we do both, but the recipients go first, so they make their ask. The dictators read that, they can make their choice, and they can write back a little message. And then the game's over. Then there's the explain ask, where again we do both, and this time the dictator goes first. The dictator says, I'm thinking about doing this, here's why. Then we take that over, the recipient gets to say, well, please do this instead. We take that back, they make the choice, and then the game's over. Okay? So this was two-way communication. Both of these are different forms of two-way communication. So the results, people generally, as you might expect, ask for 50-50. Okay? That's not a surprise. I don't think anybody would be surprised by that. And generally asking improves. And this is the first puzzle. Asking generally improves giving over the baseline. If you're a dictator and you're going to imagine what the recipient might ask for, what else would you think of? You would expect, of course, they'd ask for 50-50, but in your mind you don't act as if you had been asked for 50-50. Being asked for it makes you more likely to present that to them and give that to them. So asking generally improves what you give unless you ask for more than 50-50. We did have a few people who said, my dog died, my girlfriend left me, and I need to do my laundry. Can I have $6? That got you 0. Okay? Asking for more than 50-50 got you 0. No matter what kind of excuse or pleading you gave, you were seen as unfair, and that seemed to release people from their restriction of having to treat you fairly by having been treated unfairly. Explaining makes people much more selfish than the baseline. And here's what people do. The basic thing that people do is they take everything and they say, I'm sorry. Okay? And sometimes they say, And so what we do, but I didn't mention this before, is what we do is after we explain the game to everybody, we flip a coin. And if it's heads, this side of the room gets to be the dictators, and this side's the recipients. If it's tails, it's the opposite. Okay? So sometimes what they say is, well, it was just luck, it came up heads. If it came up tails, you would have done the same thing. Right? So in a sense, that is fair. It's fair from an ex-ante point of view. Before the coin is flipped, if we all agreed, let's just keep, if you're the dictator, you keep everything. If I'm the dictator, I'll keep everything. That's fine. We could rationalize that as having been a fair thing. All right? So what we thought was that, when people are asking, they go first. They focus on this ex post kind of fairness. That given that I'm the recipient, 50-50 is fair. Given that we're stuck in our roles, 50-50 is fair. But before we're put in our roles, keeping everything is fair as well. At least can be rationalized as fair. So whoever gets to go first, our hypothesis was, gets to set the tone and focus on which sort of norm of fairness works. So it shows that, because they say I'm sorry, it shows that they have compassion, but they aren't moved to act on it, right? Because when they say I'm sorry, they recognize that I'm hurting this other person, right? But they're not moved to act on it. Two-way communication, turns out, generates the most generosity. You might have thought that there'd be something in between the two. The recipients would ask for 50-50 and the dictators would say, I'm sorry. They don't do that. The dictators talk about fairness, and they talk about 50-50 fairness. And it doesn't matter whether they go first or second. Right? So knowing they're going to be asked, they put that in their minds to begin with. Right? So it's as if in the explained condition, they're able to avoid the beggar. Right? They're able to even though they know that if they confront the beggar, they're going to have to give him something. So in their minds, they're able to sort of avoid the beggar, unless they know they're going to be confronted with them, and they act nice. So both the ask explain and the explain ask gave us the same results, and this is sort of what it looks like. And you can see the difference. So here's our baseline is in blue, and our ask only is in purple. So you can see that a lot more 50-50s with asking. The explain is the green, and here the big pile up at 0. And hardly anybody's getting 50-50. Okay? But the ask explain and the explain ask is just the same, so I'm going to put one of them on there. Is the most likely to give 50-50. So when you could have gotten out of it, you could have given the same excuse. Actually, having been asked prevents you from doing that. So here are the puzzles. Since dictators are remorseful, they must know the recipients they must have some compassion. They have to hear directly from the recipients to act on that compassion. Two-way communication seems to reinforce that compassionate feeling rather than substitute for it. You can only ask, it's a substitute. Being able to say something is a substitute for your compassion. When you know you're going to be asked, these two things work together and amplify your altruism. So the two-way communication is like forcing you to confront that beggar, and you can't avoid them, and you must give. So we had to do one more treatment to test this out, and this is what we did on Tuesday. I'm using we very generally here. We were on an airplane as well on Tuesday while we were doing the experiment, but nonetheless. So we did something we're calling the explain and ask, or explain and ask with empathy. So what we did is first we made you make decisions for both roles of that. You're either going to be the dictator or the recipient. You don't know which one. If you're the recipient, you get to make an ask. If you're the dictator, you get to make an explain. You have to do both first, then we'll flip a coin and decide which role you are. Okay? So here you can just like the explain only, you don't have to confront that person. You can be matched with a different person. So you don't have to confront that beggar, but you do have to put yourself in their minds by being the potential recipient and having to write down an ask. And the results, here's the ask only and the explain only, and here's the explain, we call that with empathy, and the ask with empathy. So you'll notice here's the explain only, and here's the explain with empathy. Just putting yourself in the mind of the recipient is what it takes. And that's what you're able to avoid doing. This is our hypothesis. You're able to avoid doing that when you get to make an excuse and you don't, somehow in your mind you're avoiding that beggar. Okay, this is another way to look at it. Here's our two-way communication is the first two bars, and here's our one-way communication, but when you have to make decisions in both roles first. And these distributions are not significantly different statistically. Okay. In fact, this ask with empathy is maybe the standout, right? So both ask and explain results are identical to each other and identical to earlier things. So I said that. So questions for research: how can we get people to stop avoiding that beggar in their head and act on their compassion? And I think that's an interesting question. So this research suggests it might be just as simple as asking them, right? If you confront them, they have to deal with that. Quick conclusions. In the real world, the most obvious and easily measured act of compassion is charitable giving. There's lots of research on that. In the lab, we can control these interactions, try to understand specific motives. In both cases, the evidence tends to point in the same direction, that while people hold compassionate feelings, they often do not act on these unless there's some ulterior motives. There's something that forces them off of neutral and gets them in there and involved. And it could be just the idea of feeling a warm glow for giving, being part of a movement, or being asked to participate. Okay? So our work can focus on understanding what converts compassionate feelings to altruistic acts, and what are the consequences for both the givers and the receivers in that. Okay. Those are my comments.
Jim, thanks so much. I think we ought to hold questions to the end since we've got 3 more speakers. I'm quite amazed at some of the results of your studies, though. I never would have expected people would have made the choices that they made. And I wonder whether a pure altruist, if that exists, if there's a Buddhist monk somewhere who is so altruistic that he or she would not have any ulterior motives in making choices, but we can discuss that later. So our next speaker is Ulrich Mayr. He's a professor of psychology at University of Oregon. He studies executive control and its relation to memory and learning. He's also interested in cognitive development across the adult lifespan, including changes in altruistic behavior, and is very involved with investigating the neural basis of public good decisions. He's published extensively in high-profile journals like Science and Nature Neuroscience, and he's lectured internationally. And some of his recent work utilizes neuroimaging to examine more complicated paradigms, such as giving in public or private. Thanks for coming today.
Bill Newsom yesterday, in his really excellent remarks, gave me a very nice entry point by raising the question of rewards and the question to what degree we can actually see neural equivalent of reward activity, of rewards due to associated with altruistic acts, and what if we actually find something like that, what that might mean for how to view altruistic acts. Is this still true altruism, for example, by some Kantian viewpoint, where good things are only, doing good is only truly good if it hurts? So as we just heard from Jim's talk, from the within the utilitarian economist's perspective, the answer is very clear. There are sort of two broad categories of altruism. There's pure altruism and there's impure altruism, and warm glow is, as I understand it, one part of that. And the defining difference here is not whether rewards or utility is involved. They're involved in both. The critical question is only whether the utility is directly derived from the recipient's utility, or whether what you do good to somebody else is just a means to some other, ultimately egoistic goal, like signaling your wealth, your character, or just feeling good about yourself that you have good character. And what we are going to exploit when we try to identify these different motives in our experiments is the fact that for one of the two, namely the pure altruistic motive, it shouldn't matter at all how exactly the gain, the increase in utility to the recipient is achieved. Whether you're involved yourself or not is not critical, but that is very critical for the warm glow motive, because you can't feel good about yourself, you can't signal your wealth if you're not actually the responsible agent. So that's the critical aspect that we will exploit here. Now, of course, you can discuss now whether any of these two are truly altruistic, given that reward is involved. Now, one possible answer to that question is that once we accept the fact, which I think is a very reasonable assumption, that for any voluntary behavior, motives are involved, and it's basically a defining characteristic of motives that once they're fulfilled, there's some hedonic reward-related experience involved, then true altruistic behavior of the Kantian type is not really a meaningful category of behavior, and end of discussion. However, given that I'm a German, I do want to give Kant one final opportunity. But I want to suggest that sort of by taking the utilitarian framework very seriously and try to come up with the best possible way of assessing it and capturing it within individuals, we can then see to what degree there's anything left for other potential factors in explaining altruistic behavior. This is not a question that I can resolve, or we will be able to resolve with a single study or even a number of studies, but I will give you sort of one glimpse of what that might be looking like, what that might look like. So let's start with I'm going to present two studies, one very quickly that has been published a while ago, and then some where we have sort of first go through the data that mainly, the first focuses mainly on pure altruism, the second focuses mainly on impure altruism. So what did we do? As I said, the critical aspect we wanted to exploit was the fact that it should not matter how the increase in utility comes about for pure altruism. So that led to the following situation. We gave people $100 initially, all were female subjects. They were exposed to a relatively large number of scenarios of the following kind. A change to your account is noted, a change to the account of one particular charity, which is a well-known charity, very well liked in our area, and you have now two different situations. One is sort of the typical giving situation. It's voluntary. Here you have a choice. Do you want to accept that particular transfer or not? The really critical condition here is the mandatory, which you can really think of a little bit of like a tax. You don't have a choice. You simply observe that this is going to happen and you acknowledge it, just to keep the motor component constant. And then, of course, after the experiment, a mandatory and the voluntary are actually played out for real. I also have to point out that because we're interested in pure altruism in this experiment, we went to very great lengths to ensure anonymity. And we have pretty good reasons to believe that people believed, it was a very elaborate process to make people believe that nobody was watching what they were doing, even though we were watching their brains. Just the design of the transfers. We manipulated both the costs of giving and how much money reached the charity. So we manipulated independently how much the charity got here on this dimension and how much, it cost the individual. We did that mainly to have enough variability, first of all, to get a range of amounts of giving, and just to make people think about each transfer to avoid some of the repetitiveness that you get in these imaging experiments where you just need a lot of data to get anything serious. Note also there is what is noted blue here. These are the costly transfers. So here it costs you to give money, sometimes more, sometimes less. But then we also had, and this will become very important, sort of pure design cells. In these design cells, the charity gets money and it doesn't cost you anything. So think about in the mandatory situation, all you see is the charity will receive $30. Nothing else. Here, you receive $30. Nothing else. You don't have to do anything about it. It's just free money. Free money for you or free money for the charity. So what does that allow us to do? Well, first we can look at behavior. And basically that just shows that people behave in a very meaningful way. So giving goes up as more money goes to the charity. Giving goes down, this is in this direction, as giving costs more. So not very surprising, but it shows that we get a range of behavior, also across individuals, and people behave sort of in a, as you would expect from a utilitarian cost-benefit analysis perspective. First question we can ask now is, and now we focus only on the mandatory transfers, and we look at subject receiving money, the charity receiving money, and overlap. And we look at the nucleus accumbens, which is the area that Brian, for example, most forcefully has identified as an area signaling the anticipation, the processing of rewards or utility. And what we see is that both the subject and the charity and the green is the overlapping area all together activate this particular area. So that's sort of the first part of the question. Do we see, and the answer to the first part of the answer to the question, do we see reward area activity when people give money? And the answer to that is yes. Now I should add, we didn't only see that in the nucleus accumbens, we also saw that in the head of the caudate, and we also saw that in the insula. The latter is sort of a little bit strange because, you know, often the insula is associated with sort of more negative things, but we do have some reasons. I'm happy to see Tanya shaking her head, so let's just leave it at that. We have, on the next slide, independent reasons to believe that it really does signal something positive in this case. This by itself is not very definitive evidence yet. What we really need in addition is showing that this particular response to the mandatory treatments actually has implications for what people are willing to do when they are in a free choice situation. So this is the next thing here. And here now we focus on these pure conditions where either the charity receives money or where you receive money. So what we do, and this is on the mandatory, no choice again, that's important. So we take your neural response in those situations where you receive money, and we take the neural response in those conditions where the charity receives money. And now we compare these. If your neural reward areas are more active when the charity receives money than when you yourself receive money, we call you an altruist. If your neural reward is more active, areas are more active when you receive money than the charity, we call you an egoist. And we then look at how much you give when you actually have a choice to give, sort of out of treatment. So is there a nice division in egoists and altruists? And the altruists give about twice as much, and we have a relatively nice correlation of 0.54. So that indicates that these reward areas actually did process a reward, and that this does have implication for your actual choices, and it is very consistent with this utilitarian calculus that you take into regard how much it costs you, or how important money is for you, and how important is the charity's gain for you. Now, what this does, this is a nice depiction, and that's why we chose to show it in that way, the plus and the minus regions here, and it very nicely divides people up in half. But it actually, excuse me, occludes one kind of interesting, important question, because how much you care for the charity and how much you care for money yourself are not necessarily on one scalar value dimension. These could be independent components. In fact, many religious teachings sort of independently emphasize concern for the other and sort of detachment from material things. So I learned yesterday there's a word in Buddhism, and I forget it, something like non-attachment. So the non-attachment to material things is one important aspect. And so we can ask, to what degree are these actually two independent components? And if you put both aspects independently in a regression analysis, they both carry independent weight. This is basically what this shows here across all these different regions. These are the predictor, these are the coefficients that go, of course, in different directions, because the more you care for the charity, the more you give, the less you care for yourself, the more you give. And this is across all these regions, we find that same pattern, that you actually need both components and you can look at them independently. So it's not just sort of one pure altruistic response to the charity. What you also have to consider as an independent aspect is how much you care for money for yourself. So where is Kant in all of that? When we published that paper, John Tierney from the New York Times wrote a little commentary. And he pointed out two people in this scatter plot, these two here, which don't get a lot of reward out of giving, but do give a lot. So are these the two people who fulfill that very strong criterion of doing good even though it hurts? Now, of course, this is probably just statistical noise, but I think it illustrates the potential path to how you can look at that. If you have a good handle on the utilitarian component, you can now see what's up with these people. Is there anything that predicts that type of behavior? And so hold that thought, because we're going to come back to that. Do we have in this particular study any good evidence for warm glow? Well, this study wasn't necessarily set up to do so, but there is some information in that regard, because remember, everybody went through a voluntary and a mandatory treatment, and now we can see to what degree does being able to actually make a choice produce additional reward-associated activity. And the answer is in all of these areas, there is indication of that, not always completely significant. This is the significance level. But in all of these areas, it goes in the right direction. We need to consider, in addition, that if you're actually free to choose, you very often reject offers that you don't want, which is not something you can do in the mandatory, obviously, so we have to statistically control for the payoffs, but that doesn't really change the pattern very much. So there is an additional utility to free choice, per se. Now, it's not a very strong evidence by itself for warm glow, because that could be unspecific. This kind of additional utility with free choice could also happen when you choose between a gin tonic and whiskey on the bar. So it doesn't necessarily have to be associated with charitable giving. So that's one reason why in the second study, we tried to come up with a much tighter manipulation of warm glow. But another thing we wanted to do in the second study was to get a better handle on to what degree is actually this model task, the giving task, a good model for altruistic behavior, in that sense that it relates in meaningful ways to interesting outside variables. So that's why this study basically has two components, sort of a behavioral component. We also have a somewhat larger community sample, about 50 subjects, and we hopefully will be getting some more. We have a large age range. These are real people, no students, all of them working. We have a relatively large-scale assessment of personality, empathy, endorsement of pro-social norms, and we have a very detailed assessment of financial situation and their actual real-life giving behavior. And then the experimental task has a voluntary component, and I will get to that and describe that in more detail, but it also has a mandatory component where we get ratings. And now these are subjective ratings that I'm going to talk about here right now instead of the neural, so keep that difference in mind, but I'll take it sort of as a proxy of what we've seen in the last study, of dollar amounts either to yourself, to the charity, either to yourself or to the charity, again, in a mandatory situation, so no choice. So let me first get to the first aspect. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but just want to highlight some of you that you might find interesting. So that's the actual rate of giving, if you have a chance to do so. The more empathetic you are, the larger the rate of giving. And this is endorsing statements like, I often have tender, concerned feelings for people less fortunate to me. So that's kind of the emotional resonance, sympathy kind of broad component that people talked about yesterday. The distress aspect of empathy is, as you might expect, negatively correlated, even though that's not reliable. Perspective taking is reliably correlated. What we really like in this study, because that's in the context of a larger NIA project where we look at the lifespan trajectories of giving, as people grow older, they give more. And that is actually something you also find in survey data, and there's no good explanation so far why that is. It's not just a wealth effect. It's not just because people become richer, they give more. There's something else going on. And one of the goals of this whole project is finding out why that is happening. But I want to point out to you one, to us, very surprising, very large correlation, by this compared to the others. And this is the question to what degree people endorse pro-social norms. And this means answering questions or endorsing questions like, it is important to help one another so that the community in general is at a better place. If you endorse statements like that, you give lots more. This is a really nice, large correlation. And I'll get back to that. Because if there's anything sort of Kantian in our questionnaire, this is where it might show up, sort of, endorsement of norms. Now, this also relates to how much people give in the real world in the reliable way. It's not a very large correlation, but if you think of all the factors that come into play in terms of actual giving, how much you're being asked, whether you go to church or not, things like that, I think it's still reassuring that we get this kind of relationship at all to some real world outside criterion. So this is the one part of the psychometric component. Let me quickly go back to this question, utilitarian explanation versus potentially factors above and beyond that. So remember, we have the ratings of how much you like money for yourself versus transfers where you lose money or where you gain money versus transfers where the charity gains money. This is exactly the same pattern I've shown you with regard to the neural responses, where both components independently predict rate of giving and with independent signs. The more you like money for yourself, the less you give. The more you like money for the charity, the more you give. So these two hold up again in the same way, only that we don't have it with neural responses here, but with subjective ratings. But given that we know that it works with neural responses in the right areas, that I think gives some validity to this picture here. Now we can ask, to what degree are there additional factors that are not funneled through this utilitarian component here? And here's where this idea of social norms comes in, because if you add that into the picture, it does provide a very significant additional increase of explained variance. And note also, it works in part through this component here, though this coefficient now drops out as it is no longer reliable, but it doesn't at all affect this component. So it also provides some evidence that these components can also be functionally dissociated. They carry different functional relevance. But we do have some evidence here that something over and above the purely utilitarian aspect might be going on here. So now let me turn to the final, most important aspect of that study, and that is, how did we want to get at warm glow? And the critical manipulation here is whether you are observed while you give or not. Why is that important? Well, it's important because in many religious teachings, this is a very critical aspect. Rabbi Maimonides' ladder, the highest form of charity, involves unanimous donors and recipients. Neither of them are supposed to know about each other. Then you really are giving on a high level. Bill just spent some time in Venice. It was a working vacation. Yes, and actually it was a working vacation because he brought home this picture here, which is kind of hard to see. Every street corner in Venice basically has little capitals with saints, statues of saints. Why is that? As Bill found out, the main reason, and they were very explicitly put there to curb crime and civil unrest, with the idea being that if you feel watched by your favorite saint, you're going to keep in line. Now, they probably did that not with a lot of empirical evidence, but more recently there was a very nice and interesting kind of field study where in a communal coffee kitchen somewhere in England, which had a problem actually getting people to pay up for the coffee they were drinking, they just on some days placed in the back of the room posters with eyes. And on other days, it was just posters with flowers. In the days with the eyes, the rate of actually paying up increased by a factor of like 5, 6, or 7. So a very dramatic effect. Just very subtle cues of being observed. Now, that sort of leads to a very interesting hypothesis about religion. There is this evidence that religious people actually do give more in general. And one potential explanation is, well, what if you are believing in a higher entity that is omniscient, omnipresent, then you're constantly in an observed situation. You're never private. So all of that points, the presence of others is a very important regulating factor. But the question is, how does it operate? Jim's hypothesis would have to be that it actually works through the reward areas by increasing your utility of giving when you're actually observed. That's the warm glow hypothesis here that we wanted to test. So how did we do that? This is sort of now the scanning part of this experiment. Instead of all these different transfer amounts, we had a larger variety of, I think, 12 different charities, all sort of positive, in the positive range, nothing like NRA or Republican Party, something like that, just American Red Cross of that type. The critical manipulation now is, and the amounts could vary between $10, $20, and $40. The critical manipulation is sometimes you were observed, sometimes you were not. What does that mean? In the control room sat two nice, well-dressed people that you met initially, you shook hands with them, you were told, these sometimes see what you're doing, and they're keeping sort of a written record of how you behaved. But you don't have nothing else to do with them. You will never see them again. They were just sort of the public presence in the scanner room. And this screen told you, with this little mannequin here, that either watches a Macintosh monitor screen, or if it says you're not observed, it turns around and faces away from the monitor. So that's the only cue that tells you whether you're observed or not. And that was sort of a little risky because we did not know. People have shown that in public situations, people give more, but whether that would work on sort of a trial by trial within subject matter was sort of associated with some anxiety on our side. But we were lucky; it actually has a surprisingly strong effect. People give about 30% more across the three different transfer amounts when they're observed than when they're private, and there is quite a bit of individual variance. So private giving versus observed giving for individual subjects. If you would be indifferent, everybody should be on that diagonal line. Most people are above that diagonal line, but there's quite a bit of variation in that. So something to work with if you're interested in explaining the individual differences here. One more question you could ask. Do people know what's going on here? And that's a tough question, of course, because people could tell you anything. But some weeks after that experiment, people filled out these questionnaires. And one of the questions we posed to them, it's a little awkwardly phrased here. In the experiment you did in the scanner, you were sometimes observed and sometimes you were not observed. In which of these situations do you think you were more likely to give to the charity? In the observed, in the neither, or the not observed? So you could mark either of those three. Well, it turns out those people who said, I actually gave more when I was in a private situation. It was just the reverse. They actually, and this is a highly reliable result. So I don't know what to make of it, but it doesn't suggest that people had a good idea of what they were doing. And remember, we have a lot of different transfers and charities, so it's hard to keep track. So I don't think really people had an explicit strategy. I think they just went along and did something and go by their theories about themselves in answering this question, and they're obviously not very correct. So these are the regions we looked at: nucleus accumbens, again, orbital, frontal cortex, left and right, as another area that's often associated with sort of higher level integration of reward relevant information. And we also looked at as another ROI, the paracingulate cortex. The paracingulate cortex, because it's an area associated with thinking about others, so kind of a theory of mind area, as some people at least have argued. So, and I just want to say again, this is our first pass through these data, the full data set, at least at this point. And one thing we see is if you just look at the observed contrast, so those areas that are more active when you're observed versus not observed independently of anything else. And this is a pretty large blotch in the paracingulate cortex. The more active that is, the more people respond to that observed situation, which is at least consistent with the idea that the more you take this potential observer's perspective, the more you're going to respond to that in the rate of your giving. But the more important question really comes into play when we now take into consideration whether people accept or do not accept. Because that now leads to a very strong prediction. If this warm glow hypothesis is correct, the utility associated with giving should be larger when transfers are observed than when not. So we would expect modulation in the reward areas by whether or not you're observed. And looking both at the, in this case, right orbital frontal cortex, the left shows almost the same, just not reliable, and both sides of the accumbens, you see a very strong effect of public giving leads to reward. Private giving, at least in the right OFC, and if you really want to take that as kind of reward, is, if anything, not so nice. We do see a reflection of whether you are observed or not in the reward areas, which is pretty strong evidence for being observed, sort of the social presence modulating behavior through the reward areas. We also see that the amount of this interaction in the orbital frontal cortex, not in the neck, it's not reliable in the neck, but it goes in the right direction, predicting the observe effect. So how much more you give when you are observed. I'm showing again the parasinglet correlation here because it's again sort of these two provide independent predictions. So it's not clear at this point whether it's really just one mechanism through which the observe effect operates or whether there's, again, sort of, even in that component, a mixture of different motives and processes coming into play. But this is really sort of the more critical and more important result here. So I think at this point I've said enough. Just want to conclude. Consistent with the utilitarian rational choice model, we find evidence for pure altruism, the utility from fulfillment of other related goals. We find utility from money for yourself is critical as two independent components, and I think that hasn't been considered a lot, that you really have to keep those two aspects separate. And I think we have now pretty nice and clear evidence of how warm glow, in this case, implemented through being observed, operates. And the question, is there altruistic behavior outside these rational choice considerations? We do have some evidence that these pro-social norms might have sort of an independent effect over and above. And I think it's important, if that was true, to think a little bit about what that might mean. In some ways, it might just mean that people at some earlier point in their life have made sort of a utilitarian decision to, I just want to endorse that particular norm and stick to that. Because one thing that does, it then relieves you of the need of making that decision over and over again when the circumstances arise. And that's one thing that rules of behavior do for us. We don't have to make the decision over and over again, and you just make it once. And so this is something we might be seeing here, and I just want to add here, it's just an additional analysis that I made this morning. If these norms operate sort of in an independent manner, then one other thing you might see is that those people who are very high in terms of endorsing these norms, these utilitarian predictions should break down, and that is what you see. People who operate on the basis of these norms seem to be giving because they have these norms. They don't take the cost benefits into regard anymore. You see these cost benefits analysis only for those people who are relatively low in terms of endorsing these norms. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ulrich. Again, I think we'll hold questions for the end and a general discussion. Fascinating talk, particularly the verification of warm glow and being observed, increasing the utility of giving. So, I wonder whether we could somehow channel our reward systems such that, our reward systems in the brain are satisfied by giving, if that could substitute for overeating and overindulgence in sexual activities. But again, we'll discuss that later. So Our next speaker is Bill Harbaugh, a professor of economics at University of Oregon. Bill utilizes neuroeconomic methods to study altruism and motives for charitable giving, and is also interested in the economic behavior of children. When I first met Bill in 2007, I was immediately impressed by his seminal work, which Ulrich just showed, which was published in Science, showing that these reward-related areas in the brain are activated both by selfishly keeping money in egoists, as well as by charitable giving in altruists, and also that you could predict giving based solely on the neural response on fMR. Some of his current work focuses on brain activation in recipients of charity. Bill has been very involved in our project Compassion and CCARE. He was part of our delegation that made the pilgrimage to Seattle last year to meet with the Dalai Lama. So join me again in welcoming Bill today.
So thanks for that introduction, and I just wanted to thank a few people. First, Jim Andreoni for getting me involved in the study of altruism, which has been a very interesting and rewarding activity for me. Then also I wanted to thank Ulrich for getting me involved in neuroscience and to using these imaging techniques, which have just been absolutely fascinating, both I think in the sense of what they reveal about charitable giving, and also just intrinsically been the most interesting part of my scientific life is just to be able to see what's happening inside brains as people make decisions, and that's, I just can't say how interesting that has made my recent work. I've kind of gotten obsessed about it. The three of us have been working on charitable giving for a while, and this whole conference has revolved around the notion of charitable giving. It's been dominated by the causes of charitable giving. So we've heard a lot of talk about compassion as being a motive that leads to an act of charitable giving. But what we haven't talked about much, we've talked a lot about the benefits of compassion for the giver, right? So this is, I think, one of the primary focuses of this conference is this idea that acting compassionately helps you as a giver in some way or another, and we've seen some neural evidence for that too. But there's been almost no talk about the recipients of charity, and every time there's a charitable act, there are two people involved, right? Somebody's giving up the money, somebody's getting the money too. And so this is a first attempt to try looking at the receiving side of charitable giving. Motivation for this is pretty straightforward. To the recipient, you know, it's a catchphrase to say that charity is something of a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it provides, you know, real resources that the charity, that the recipient can use, but it also might create a sense of shame in the recipient, right? Why is it that I need help? And why is it that somebody else has enough resources to give me help? I might not feel good about myself because of that. There might be some sort of stigma attached to this. So lots of negative feelings could potentially arise in the recipient of charitable contributions or any kind of assistance. And a truly altruistic donor is going to want to understand the feelings that his act induces in the recipient, okay? And one of the great things about the fMRI techniques is, you know, I'm not claiming that this can do too much, but it gives us an attempt to look at feelings. It gives us at least the beginnings of a method to look at the feelings of people. And that's crucial when you're thinking about recipients. When you're talking about donors, you can look at the act. You can look at observed behavior, right? And use that. But when you're looking at recipients, there's not any act. They're sitting there passively getting aid. And so you really need some way of figuring out how they're feeling that does not involve looking at observed behavior, okay? So this has been a subject that's been studied not by economists, but by a lot of other disciplines. So go back to Maimonides again, and this, his belief that anonymous gifts were the highest form of giving. Actually, the way that worked, they were supposed to be mutually anonymous so that the recipient didn't know who the gift was coming from, so the recipient couldn't feel a sense of obligation to the giver, okay? And so that's a way of diminishing the negative effects of receiving charity. In the United States now, in San Francisco, they have the homeless news. So that's an attempt to change charity into an economic exchange that benefits both parties. And I think that the motivation for that is to take away some of the stigma associated with accepting aid from other people. In anthropology, there's this whole language about gifts creating obligations for people. So, in some cultures, you don't want to accept a gift from somebody else because you're going to have to reciprocate, and it could be extremely expensive for you. It could ruin you. So people, talking about crossing the street to avoid, you see the guy coming to give you money and you run. Okay, I can't afford to take that from you. In standard economics, Jim mentioned this, things like food stamps have extremely low take-up rates. So 50% of the people who are eligible for food stamps in the United States take it up. Why is that? Well, partly it's, there's a lot of paperwork involved in getting the aid, but partly there's a stigma associated with it. It used to be the case that food stamps were literally coupons that you could use at the grocery store, and everybody behind you in line saw when you pulled out these coupons. They've now changed to a system where you get a card, a cash card, and that has increased the take-up rate for food stamps, presumably by reducing the stigma attached to it, okay? So there has been some work looking at the receiving side of charitable giving, but to our knowledge, this is the first attempt to do that using neuroscience. So let me talk a little bit about the basics here. We're using a student sample here. In the previous work Ulrich talked about, we had a community sample. These are just University of Oregon undergraduate students. There are 20 of them so far. They're mixed genders. We recruit them so that they're moderately high need and moderately high GPA. And the way that we do that is by screening subjects so that they've got a grade point average between 3 and 3.8, okay? So they're not fantastic students, but they're good students, okay? Then when it comes to need, we screen, only accept the students who are receiving some financial aid from the university, but not the maximum Pell Grant. If the maximum Pell Grant, you come up from a very poor family. So our students are needy. They're receiving they're eligible for some federal aid, but they're not the neediest students. They're smart, but they're not the smartest students, okay? And so we're going to, that's the sample. This is a very straightforward experiment. They come in and they receive scholarships, essentially, from us, okay? And of course, while they receive these, they're inside the scanner, in this case a 3T scanner, and we'll look at some behavioral data and also some bold response data. I should say that Jim's research assistant was up late last night working on his presentation. I was late last night working on this presentation. We need to talk about research assistants sometime. So this is very rough, work here. Okay, so this is part of the protocol. They come in and they see a screen. They're being interviewed by the experimenter, and we say, we have 2 different merit-based scholarship funds. These scholarships reward students for successful effort in their academic coursework, okay? So you're getting the scholarship because you worked hard and got good grades. Eligibility is determined on GPA. High GPA fund is for students with GPAs between 3 and 3.8. All of our subjects fit in there, okay? The very high GPA fund is for students with GPAs above 3.8, and none of our students are technically qualified for that fund, okay? And similarly for need-based, we have a fund that all the students are qualified for, and then a very high need scholarship that none of them are qualified for. Of course, they don't realize that, that everyone in the experiment falls into the same category, but that doesn't matter. It's, just otherwise we would have had to recruit a lot of subjects and we couldn't use their data. So that's the basic part of the experiment. They're told that your scholarship is going to reduce the amount that's available for other students, okay? And this is a key part of accepting charitable aid. Is when you accept charity, there's less available for other people who may be needy, in fact, maybe even needier than you are, okay? So anytime you accept charity, there's this opportunity cost, and that you're reducing the amount that's available for other people. We want to make this as realistic as possible, so we do that in the experiment. That varies. So sometimes they're told, you get a $100 scholarship, that's $100 out of the pool. Other times we tell them, you get the $100 scholarship, we'll top up the pool with another $50 from our vast resource of dollar bills that we've got stashed in the back here. And so that other money will still be available to help other people. Okay, so we're sort of manipulating the prices just to keep things more interesting. They're told that there are going to be 96 trials, 60 of them are mandatory. Mandatory meaning, here's the scholarship, you can't turn it down. I guess you could rip the check up at the end of the experiment, but that's it. 36 of them are voluntary, so you're told, here's a scholarship, you don't have to take this money, you can say no and leave the money for other people, okay? One of each counts for the payoff. the subjects could receive as much as $300 plus a show-up fee, and they did. We had subjects walking out of there with $300 in scholarships, and we can say that they seemed quite happy, okay? But we'll see what's going on inside their brains and see which kinds of people are reacting differently. Everything's randomized, and one thing about this design that I really like is this is, this is what students do, right? So these are students who are getting financial aid. This is just a little bit more of something that they're, normally they get as part of their day-to-day life as a student. Okay, so there's nothing strange about this experiment, except, of course, we're looking inside their head while they make the decisions. But this is ecologically a totally valid experiment, right? We're taking students, we're giving them fellowships, scholarships. Okay, so the experiment works like this. They are lying in the scanner. They're told the amount of the scholarship. They see a screen like this. They're told the cost to others. They're not reminded of the eligibility. So in this example, this would be a mandatory one. They're just told you're going to get money from the very high GPA fund. We don't tell them, remember, you're not really a very high GPA student, but they seem to know that. We tell them the scholarship is going to be $100 in the upper left, and there's going to be $100 less in that fund for other qualified students when you get this money, okay? That's the mandatory treatment. In the voluntary treatments, there would be choice buttons that would pop up and say, you could turn this down. Remember, you're not really a very high GPA guy. You might want to turn it down, and they have the ability to do that. So the timeline looks like this. They see a fixation dot, then they see the choice screen, and this would be a mandatory one, so there's actually no choice. And instead of a yes/no button, there would be an accept and invalid key. You can't turn it down. Okay, and so they see this choice screen for about 10 seconds. Then they react within about a second and a half, and then there's this cool down period of about 12 seconds. Okay, that's the basic experiment. The design of this experiment, I mentioned the fact that some of it is mandatory. They're just told they're going to get a scholarship. Some they have the chance to turn the scholarship down. We have a pretty complete design here. So for example, here's scholarships where you get $50 and it doesn't reduce the amount available for other people at all. So there are 4 trials like that. 4 trials where you get 100 doesn't reduce the amount. But most of the trials are expensive. So for this one, for example, 4 of these, you get a $150 scholarship, and there's $150 less for other people available. Right? So, and then similarly, there's a voluntary component to it where you can say no, and those are basically the same kinds of transfers. Sometimes they're, the cost of them to other people changes. But everybody clear on that? Basic design? Okay, so first result, it's amazing. People turn down money, okay? And so these are the subjects. So there's a line here for every subject. And these are the subjects. They accept less than half of the time when they're given a scholarship, okay? There are 3 people up here who say all the time they'll take the money. Yeah, I only get $50 and it costs other people $150. I don't care. I'm taking the money. Okay, but these people down here, they're typically they're saying no often. And I'll show you when they're saying no in a minute. Okay, but so this worked out beautifully with 20 people. I mean, you can't imagine they're homogeneous in terms of their characteristics. Their behavior is very heterogeneous, right? Okay, so what do they accept and what do they reject? Well, we tell them that they're qualified or not qualified. And here are the funds that they're qualified for, the need-based funds and the merit-based funds. And 80% of them will accept those funds. So that's, you tell them they're qualified for it, even though it might be expensive for other people who are also qualified. I think people think, well, why not me? I'm qualified. I'm going to take this money. On the other hand, when we tell them, you're not really qualified for this, but you kind of slip through the cracks and you're going to get the money unless you say no. Half the time people are saying, no thanks, $150, that's pretty amazing. Okay. They're also very responsive to the prices here. So, anytime you are going to listen to an economist present something like this, they're going to talk about prices, and because that's kind of our test of rationality, and we might not believe that price is the only thing that matters, but it should matter at least a little bit, or people aren't understanding the experiment. And so these are the acceptance rates again, and when it's only a $50 scholarship, acceptance rates are not so high. $150 scholarship, people are saying yes almost all the time. As you go down here, the bigger the cost to other people, the less likely they are to accept the money. So that's altruism, right? these people are saying, yeah, I don't really, I know that I might even be qualified for this money, but it's going to hurt other people. There's going to be less in the pool for other people. They're going to say no. So this is just, I think, behaviorally very nice data. Okay, now let me move to the ROI stuff. So we have very crude analysis here. We have very large regions of the brain, and we basically take the time course out of those regions, and we try to correlate those with various elements of the experiment. And first thing I can say is that the activations differences by the amounts are sensible. So when you get bigger scholarship, you generally get more activation in the nucleus accumbens and the caudate. That's familiar. That's consistent with Brian Knutson's stuff. That money shows up in these areas of the ventral striatum. When other people lose money, that's associated with lower nucleus accumbens and caudate activation, and that's consistent with our previous results that Ulrich was talking about. Okay, and so I talked about the responses and stuff. Okay, so voluntary trials now. We've got subjects. The previous results, the behavioral stuff came from the voluntary trials, but we have some neural data from the mandatory ones. Now let's switch to the neural data from the voluntary trials where people can say, no thanks, I don't want your help. And this is, same sort of thing that happens with real charity. And the first question we might ask is giving people a choice about charity a good thing to do or not? Okay? And remember, we're trying to take the recipient's perspective here. So, the first answer is it's kind of mixed. There's not really much difference in activation in these reward areas like the caudate, the putamen, the nucleus accumbens. I mean, there's some stuff, but it's pretty noisy, and I doubt it's statistically significant. But there's a huge, look at this pattern in the, and this is the cingulate cortex, the anterior cingulate. And in the blue one is where there's no choice. And when you have to make a choice, you show huge activation in this region, which is well known to be associated with making choices. And there's two spikes, one when you get the information, and then immediately after 10 seconds after you've made the choice. So that's very, sensible result. Okay, but we don't really, this doesn't tell us much except for that, people are thinking about making a choice, which economists believed all along. But here's what's interesting. So here is, we're taking the people who are qualified, okay, and I'm comparing their activation in the mandatory conditions where they get money and their activation in the voluntary conditions when they get money, okay? And so this is money that you're qualified for, okay? And what we're seeing is in the voluntary conditions, you get more activation in these reward areas, right? So you're given a choice about taking this charity, but you're qualified for it. That's great, you don't feel bad about that, okay? Now look at what happens when you get charity that you're told you're not, in fact, you're not really told blatantly you're not qualified for it. You're told you're not that high GPA, and this is a high GPA charity or fellowship. What we find here is that people show more activation in the mandatory conditions where they don't get a choice about it, right? So if you want to, if you want to consider the feelings of the recipient, it's sort of subtle. If they don't feel like they deserve the charity, you might not want to give them a big choice about whether they take it or not, okay? On the other hand, if they know that they deserve it, you kind of want to fool them and tell them, you could always say no to this, but boy, you really deserve it. And they'll feel great about that, or at least if you take this neural data in that sort of simplistic view of it, which I'm happy to do. Okay, and so that's just the same, showing the absolute flip in these things between the case where you're qualified for the charity and you're not qualified for it, the sort of striking result there. The corroborating evidence of this is the accepting qualified charity that you're qualified for versus unqualified. So you're, more activation in these reward areas, that's a little messy when you're told that you're qualified for this charity. And then last thing, can we predict rejection of charity by activation? So remember, there's a huge amount of heterogeneity across these people. Some always take the money, some almost never take the money. And so we'd sort of want to know, if there's one question is like, how do you design charitable giving or a nonprofit so that it doesn't impose psychic costs on the recipient? But when recipients are really heterogeneous, you've got to consider the fact that they're all different and think about that. And so these results are absolutely stunning, I think, that these are people who accept charity, and this is their activation in the low-cost conditions where accepting charity doesn't really hurt other people, and this is activation in the high-cost conditions where it really does impose we're taking money essentially from other people, okay? And so I got to say there's a huge amount of noise in these data, and as dramatic as these differences look, they're barely statistically significant. We have a lot of work to do with this. On the other hand, these are very large anatomical areas. This is the most conservative possible approach that we could use, and we're still getting interesting results out of it. And I'll kind of skip through that. So conclusions about this, in the giver, compassionate feelings lead to charity. Giving is voluntary, and so from an economic point of view, it's got to be good for the giver, otherwise they wouldn't do it. But every act of charity has a recipient as well as a giver, and receiving charity can be questionably in terms of its effect on the recipient. One way to think about it is if the recipient is empathetic and knows the opportunity of taking the gift, accepting the gift might actually make them feel bad because they know that it's come from somebody who might be just as deserving, if not more deserving. And I think that really matters with charitable giving because you're giving money to people who are low income, poor people. They know what it's like to be in that situation, right? We might not understand it as well as the recipients of it do. So the cost to them could, it's very easy to imagine that it could be large, and this, I think, is consistent with the argument that it's going to be large here. Stigma, diminished self-worth, guilt and shame, we don't have anything yet to say about that, but I think those are all questions that could be asked with variations on this kind of experiment. Clearly, we show that there's some sort of neural cost to accepting charity, different neural reactions to different kinds of charity, whether you're qualified or not, whether it's need or merit. We're seeing some evidence of that. Cross-subject differences in the neural responses to the mandatory conditions. Again, like in the charitable giving paper, they predict whether you'll accept charity here or not. So conclusions about this a little bit, that we've got to keep in mind that low take-up of charity is not always a bad thing. You don't want undeserving people accepting charity. You want them to leave the money for people who really deserve it. Well, but the way that you make sure that they do that is by making sure they feel a little bit bad if they take the money that they don't deserve. And so that's, imposing a cost on them. So stigma, the welfare stigma, it's got its pluses and its minuses. The plus is it funnels the money to people who really deserve it. The minus is it imposes costs on people who haven't done anything wrong. Okay? And I think that's where I'll stop. Thanks.